The house was old, really old. It was the kind of place you could smell before you stepped inside. A blend of damp wood, faint mildew, and the earthy scent of the forest just beyond the back porch. The walls, once painted a pale yellow, were faded and peeling, revealing layers of grayish plaster beneath. The air inside was cool and still, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Casey noticed the peculiar quiet immediately. No hum of distant traffic, no chirp of crickets, just an eerie, weighty silence that settled over him like a heavy blanket. The floors creaked under his every step, betraying him no matter how lightly he tried to walk. The dim lighting didn't help. Most of the bulbs were low wattage, and several fixtures seemed to have been out for years. Shadows pooled in the corners of every room, thick and unmoving, as if the light couldn't quite reach them. The kitchen, though serviceable, was stuck in another era. Linoleum floors warped with age, a refrigerator that rattled intermittently, and cabinets that never quite closed all the way. Paul fit the house. He seemed as much a relic as the chipped banisters and tarnished brass doorknobs. Casey couldn't quite put his finger on what was odd about him at first. Paul dressed simply, sweaters, slacks, and house slippers, and moved with a deliberate slowness that made Casey wonder if he was twice as old as he looked. His eyes were sharp, though, always watching, not in an intrusive way, but in the same quiet, thoughtful manner he approached everything else. He didn't talk much, but when he did, there was something clipped and formal about his speech, like someone unused to casual conversation. At first, Casey chalked Paul's quirks up to the general weirdness of sharing a home with a stranger, but it was the porridge that made things start to feel wrong. The first time Casey noticed the porridge, it was the smell that caught his attention. It was subtle, almost comforting, a faint trace of oats mingled with the richness of butter, cutting through the damp, musty scent of the old kitchen. He hadn't paid it much mind at first. Maybe Paul was just particular about his late-night snacks. But the ritual was unmissable. Every evening, right around the same time, Paul would move with quiet precision, setting out the bowl on the counter as if following an invisible script. There was something meticulous, almost reverent, in the way he did it, smoothing the butter with the back of a spoon until it gleamed golden in the dim kitchen light. What struck Casey as odd wasn't the fact itself, but the aftermath. By morning, the bowl was always gone, scrubbed clean and back in its place on the drying rack. Paul never mentioned eating it, and Casey, on more than one occasion, had stayed up late enough to see the bowl still sitting there, untouched as the hours crawled toward dawn. Yet, come morning, it was as though it had never been there at all. At first, Casey dismissed it as some quirky habit. Maybe Paul had a strange diet. Maybe he liked his porridge cold and snuck out after Casey went to bed. The more he watched, the less it made sense. Why go to the trouble of making something so simple, only to leave it sitting out in the open? Why the butter, perfectly centered every time? There was an eerie precision to the whole thing that made Casey's skin prickle. One night, unable to shake his growing curiosity, Casey lingered in the kitchen longer than usual. He pretended to scroll on his phone, but his eyes were locked on Paul. As he moved around the room, Paul worked in silence, his face unreadable as he prepared the bowl. When he finally placed it on the counter, he hesitated. his hand lingering over the spoon for just a second too long. For a moment, Casey thought he saw Paul's lips move, as if whispering something, but the words, if there were any, were too quiet to hear. Then, without a glance in Casey's direction, Paul left the room, retreating to his bedroom and shutting the door softly behind him. The porridge sat there, warm and fragrant, the butter slowly melting into the oats. The room felt different in Paul's absence, darker, heavier, as if the air itself were holding something Casey couldn't quite name. He stared at the bowl for what felt like hours, waiting for something, but nothing happened. Eventually he turned off the light and went to bed, the faint scent of butter and oats following him like a phantom. The exchange replayed itself in Casey's mind long after it happened. He hadn't meant to sound accusing when he finally asked, but the question had slipped out before he could stop himself. "Hey, Paul, what's with the porridge?" Casey had said, keeping his tone light as they passed each other in the dim hallway one evening. The shadows seemed heavier than usual, the bare bulb above casting uneven patches of light. Paul froze mid-step, his back stiffening. He turned to look at Casey, his face unreadable at first, but then a flicker of something crossed his features. Was it annoyance or fear? Casey couldn't quite tell. "It's just something I do," Paul said, his voice unusually tight, almost clipped. His gaze didn't linger, and he brushed past Casey quickly, heading toward his room. "Yeah, but like why?" Casey pressed, turning to face him. "You don't eat it. I've noticed. It just sits there." Paul stopped but didn't turn back. For a long moment, the silence between them was so heavy that Casey could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. When Paul finally spoke, his tone was soft, but there was an edge to it, a quiet urgency that made the hairs on the back of Casey's neck stand up. "You don't need to worry about it," Paul said, almost under his breath. "Just leave it alone." Then, without another word, he disappeared into his room, the door clicking shut behind him. Casey stood there for a while, staring at the closed door. The whole exchange had left him feeling strangely unsettled, though he couldn't quite pinpoint why. It wasn't just Paul's evasiveness. It was the way he said, "leave it alone," like it was a warning, not a request. There was something more to it, something he didn't want Casey to know. That night, as Casey passed through the kitchen on his way to bed, the familiar bowl of porridge sat on the counter, the butter slowly pooling into the oats under the weak kitchen light. The smell hung in the air, warm and faintly sweet, but it didn't feel comforting anymore. It felt oppressive, like the bowl was daring him to touch it, to break the unspoken rule Paul seemed so adamant about. For the first time, Casey felt something new beneath his irritation, a quiet, creeping unease. What was Paul hiding? Why did it feel like the answer was staring him in the face, softening into golden streaks in the warm porridge? One night, weeks later, Casey found himself defiantly mesmerized. The bowl was still warm when Casey picked it up, the heat of it seeping into his hands. The butter had mostly melted, pooling around the edges in greasy swirls, but the oats were thick and congealed, their texture uneven. The smell was cloying now, heavier than before, as if the porridge had been sitting there just long enough to turn faintly sour. Casey wrinkled his nose, but didn't stop. He was done with this nonsense. He hesitated for just a moment, the spoon hovering over the bowl. A strange thought flickered in his mind. What if this actually matters? But he shook it off. It was ridiculous. It was just oats and butter, not some sacred offering. The whole thing was absurd, and he wasn't going to let Paul's weird superstition dictate the house. With a decisive motion, he scooped up a spoonful and shoved it into his mouth. The taste was worse than he expected. It wasn't bland, it was bitter, almost metallic, with a strange aftertaste that made his stomach turn. He gagged, spitting it back into the sink, and glared at the bowl as if it had offended him personally. "Gross," he muttered, rinsing his mouth with tap water. Figures he wouldn't eat it. With a defiant flourish, he tipped the rest of the porridge into the sink. It slid out sluggishly, clinging to the bowl as though reluctant to leave. The butter made the oats slippery and sticky all at once, coating the sides of the sink in greasy streaks. Casey turned the tap on full blast, letting the water pound the mess into the drain, and scrubbed the bowl clean. When he set it back on the drying rack, the counter looked empty for the first time in weeks. The act felt oddly satisfying, like he'd just won a small, petty war. House felt lighter somehow, as though he'd reclaimed a part of it from Paul's strange rituals. Casey allowed himself a smug grin as he flicked off the kitchen light and headed to bed. But as he passed the hall leading to Paul's room, the shadows seemed thicker than usual, the air felt colder, and the faint smell of porridge lingered, clinging to his clothes and skin despite the steaming water he used to wash it away. He paused, staring at Paul's closed door. For a brief moment he thought he heard something, a low murmur like Paul's voice, but it sounded wrong. The cadence was too soft, too quick, almost like a prayer. Casey shook his head, dismissing it as imagination. He made his stand, and that was that. Whatever weird game Paul was playing, it was over now. Feeling victorious, Casey climbed into bed, but the unease stayed with him, curling around his chest like a shadow he couldn't quite shake. He fell asleep to the sound of the wind rattling the old windows, though it carried a strange cadence, almost like distant whispers. Casey awoke to the gray light of early morning seeping through the thin curtains, the kind of light that made the room feel colder than it actually was. His head pounded with a dull, relentless throb, and every joint in his body ached as if he'd spent the night wrestling invisible weights. His mouth was dry, and when he shifted to sit up, a wave of nausea rolled through him, sharp and sudden, leaving him momentarily breathless. The dreams were still with him, clinging to the edges of his mind like cobwebs. He couldn't piece them together, but fragments remained, flashes of something moving through the woods, its silhouette indistinct, but fast, too fast. There had been a voice, too, soft and urgent, murmuring words he couldn't understand, and then that awful sensation of being watched, not by a person, but by something bigger, older, and infinitely more patient. His room felt wrong, as if it had shifted slightly in the night. The air was heavy, carrying a faint dampness that hadn't been there before, and the smell of the house, wood, mildew, and faint decay, seemed sharper, more oppressive. Even the light filtering in felt muted, as though it were struggling to reach him. He rubbed his eyes and sat on the edge of the bed, the wooden floor cold against his bare feet. As he stood and stretched, the ache in his muscles felt unnatural, like a deep-rooted fatigue that no amount of rest could shake. His gaze fell to the floor, and he noticed faint scratches on the wood near the doorframe, long, thin marks that hadn't been there before. Casey frowned, crouching to examine them, but the lines were shallow and irregular, as if something had dragged across the surface in jagged movements. He shook it off, blaming the restless night and the house's uncanny ability to amplify his nerves. As he stepped into the hallway, the smell of butter and oats hit him like a wall. It was stronger than it had ever been, sour and cloying, curling in his nostrils and turning his stomach. The kitchen, when he entered, was empty, but the lingering scent made his skin crawl. The counter where the porridge usually sat was pristine, wiped clean, and the drying rack was empty. No sign of the bowl he'd watched and left there the night before. Casey frowned, his headache pulsing harder now, opening the cabinets to check if Paul had taken the bowl. Everything was in its place, but the bowl was missing. A chill ran through him as he closed the cabinet door, the faint sound of a creak echoing from the hallway behind him. Casey turned quickly, his pulse quickening. The hall was empty, its shadows stretching longer than they should in the weak morning light. Something about the house felt alive now, watching him with the same unsettling intensity he'd felt in his dreams. He shook his head, trying to dispel the feeling. It was just the poor sleep and the lingering headache. Nothing more. But as he moved through the air grew colder, and the weight of unseen eyes pressed heavier against his back. "Stop throwing it out!" The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable, like the chill that seemed to settle over the house in recent days. Casey leaned back in his chair, cradling his sore wrist, his laugh fading in an uneasy silence. Paul stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim kitchen light, his face pale but unreadable. For a moment, Casey swore the air between them shifted, thicker, colder, as though the house itself had taken offense. Paul didn't laugh, didn't smile, didn't even flinch. He just stood there, his tired eyes fixed on Casey with unnerving intensity. "It's not just food," Paul said, his voice low and calm, but there was something underneath it, a quiet urgency, almost like pleading. "You don't understand. It's important." Casey scoffed, brushing off the unease curling in his stomach. "What, are you feeding the ghost now, or some forest spirit? Come on, Paul, you can't seriously believe that superstitious crap." Paul didn't respond immediately. Instead, he crossed his arms, leaning slightly against the doorframe. His gaze didn't waver, and the silence stretched long enough for Casey to feel its weight pressing down on him. When Paul finally spoke, his voice was softer, almost too quiet to hear. "You don't have to believe it. Just don't disrespect it." The words sent a chill down Casey's spine, though he couldn't explain why. The way Paul said it, like it wasn't a warning, but a fact, something unchangeable and absolute, made Casey's irritation flare. He was tired. Tired of the strange rituals, tired of Paul's cryptic comments, tired of feeling like the house itself was against him. "Look," Casey said, standing and setting his coffee-stained mug down harder than he meant to. "I don't know what your deal is, but this house is falling apart. The pipes groan, the floors creak, and the draft in here is enough to freeze me solid at night. If you think a bowl of porridge is keeping the roof over our heads, You're delusional. Paul's expression didn't change, but his shoulders tensed slightly, his fingers curling around his elbows. I'm not the one you need to convince, he said almost too softly, before turning and disappearing down the hallway. Casey stared after him, the sound of Paul's door shutting echoing faintly through the house. The tension lingered long after he was gone, seeping into the air like smoke. Casey shook his head, muttering to himself as he returned to his desk. His laptop, still lifeless despite every trick he tried, sat there like a taunt. His eyes darted to the corner of the room where his shoes were missing. Again. The frustration boiled in his chest, but as he settled back into his chair, he couldn't help glancing toward the dark hallway. For a moment, the shadows seemed to move, curling and shifting like something alive. He shook his head, forcing himself to focus. But even as he tried to convince himself it was all in his head, Paul's words repeated in his mind over and over, like a quiet, insistent whisper. You don't have to believe it. Just don't disrespect it. The sound had started faintly, just as Casey was drifting off to sleep. A soft, rhythmic murmur, too muffled to make out, but insistent enough to tug him from the edge of unconsciousness. At first he thought it was the wind, maybe the old house groaning under the weight of its years. But as he lay there, heart thudding against his ribs, he realized the noise coming from down the hall. Paul's room. It was a voice. No, voices. Low and urgent, their tones rising and falling in an unsettling cadence, like an argument carried on in whispers. Casey strained to make out words, but heard only fragments. A pleading tone here, a sharp hiss there. There was something unnerving about the way they blended, like two streams running over jagged rocks, disjointed and unnatural. Unable to ignore it any longer, Casey slid out of bed, his bare feet meeting the icy floorboards. The hallway was cloaked in shadow, the air colder than it should have been. As he moved closer to Paul's door, the voices became clearer, though they still didn't sound right. They weren't entirely human, too guttural, too layered, as if one voice was speaking over another in perfect unison. His hand hovered over the doorknob. Casey wasn't sure why he felt so uneasy. It was just Paul, but something about the sound, the way it filled the air, made his fingers tremble. Steeling himself, he pushed the door open, just enough to peer inside. Paul was sitting on the edge of his bed, hunched over with his head in his hands. The room was dim, lit only by a single flickering candle on the windowsill. The shadows it cast danced across the walls in unnatural patterns, their movements jerky and almost deliberate. Casey scanned the room, his heart pounding. There was no one else there, no sign of the voices that had pulled him from his bed. The room was still, but the air felt thick, pressing against him like an unseen weight. He opened his mouth to say something, to ask Paul if he was okay, but the words caught in his throat. Paul lifted his head slightly, just enough for Casey to see the expression on his face. His eyes were red-rimmed, his features tight with something Casey couldn't quite name. Fear? Resignation? Whatever it wasn't like the calm, measured Paul he was used to. He looked haunted. What do you want, Casey? Paul's voice was quiet, barely audible over the pounding of Casey's own heart. There was no anger in it, but it wasn't welcoming either. I thought I heard something. Casey stammered, suddenly feeling foolish. Voices. Paul didn't react immediately. He just stared at the floor, his shoulders rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. Finally he spoke, his tone weary and heavy. You shouldn't be here. Casey blinked, startled by the sharpness of the words. You shouldn't be here, Paul repeated, this time more forcefully. His eyes flicked up to meet Casey's, and for a brief moment they seemed darker, almost hollow, as though something deeper lurked just beneath the surface. Go back to bed. The room seemed colder now, the flickering candlelight casting jagged shadows that stretched too far, curling toward the doorway where Casey stood. He didn't argue. Something in Paul's voice made it impossible to protest. He nodded mutely, backing out of the room and shutting the door behind him. As he walked back to his door, the voices started up again, faint but unmistakable, weaving through the stillness of the house like a thread pulling tighter and tighter. Casey climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to his chin, but the sound stayed with him, growing fainter only as sleep finally overtook him. When he woke the next morning, the house was silent, but the memory of those voices lingered, clawing at the edges of his mind. For the first time, Casey began to wonder if Paul's warnings weren't just superstition, and if he'd made a mistake that couldn't be undone. The days blurred into one another, a haze of sickness and unease that settled over Casey like a second skin. His relentless cold worsened, leaving him pale and gaunt, his energy sapped to the point where even getting out of bed felt like a monumental effort. His chest ached with each breath, and his throat burned, but no amount of rest or medicine seemed to help. He tried calling his friends, desperate for a familiar voice, but the responses were curt, distant. Sorry, I'm busy. Or maybe another time. It was as though an invisible wall had sprung up around him, isolating him further. The house itself grew more oppressive with each passing day. The creaks and groans of the old wood seemed louder now, almost deliberate, as if the house were alive and shifting, just out of sight. Doors that Casey was certain he had closed would creak open at odd angles, revealing empty, shadow-filled rooms. Objects disappeared from where he'd left them, only to reappear in strange places. His keys on top of the refrigerator, a missing shoe shoved under the couch. Once he found his phone sitting in the sink, screen cracked and water pooling around it. He swore he hadn't left it there. At night, the noises came. The faint scratching behind the walls, too rhythmic to be mice. The steady, deliberate sound of footsteps pacing the hallway outside his room. And once, just once, a laughed, soft and chilling, as though something had found his misery amusing. The sound made his blood run cold, and he spent the rest of the night clutching his blanket, staring at the door, certain it would swing open to reveal something waiting for him. Paul, meanwhile, was the picture of calm. If anything, he seemed better, more vibrant, more alive. His cheeks had more color, his posture was more relaxed, and even his voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there. He continued his porridge routine, though the ritual had changed. Now, instead of leaving it on the counter, he carried the bowl straight to his room. Casey watched him one night, his curiosity outweighing his exhaustion, as Paul moved with quiet purpose through the kitchen. The scene was almost reverent. Paul's hands trembled slightly as he prepared the porridge, smoothing the butter into a perfect golden disk with a precision that bordered on obsessive. As he lifted the bowl, Casey caught a glimpse of his face. Casey's expression wasn't just focused, it was filled with something deeper, something that made Casey's stomach twist. It was fear, yes, but also a strange kind of awe, as though he were performing a sacred act. Paul muttered under his breath as he carried the bowl down the hallway, his lips forming words Casey couldn't quite catch. They were soft, rhythmic, almost like a chant. Casey's skin prickled, but he couldn't quite bring himself to speak or follow. He stood frozen in the doorway of his room, watching as Paul disappeared into the shadows, his door clicking shut behind him. The air in the house felt heavier than ever that night, pressing against Casey's chest like an invisible weight. He lay awake in the dark, listening for the now familiar sounds of the house. But all he could hear was the faint rhythmic murmur of Paul's voice coming from the other side of the hall. It wasn't comforting. It was a reminder of what Casey didn't know. But it left him staring at the ceiling until the gray light of the morning began to creep through the curtains. The thought hit him then, cold and hard. Paul wasn't eating the porridge. He couldn't be. Casey remembered Paul mentioning in passing that he was allergic to oats. So why was he still making it? And why did he treat it like something sacred? The question gnawed at Casey, refusing to let go, as the house around him seemed to close in tighter. Paul's words hung in the air, thick and suffocating, like the oppressive weight that seemed to saturate the house itself. Casey stood in the dimly lit kitchen, his fists clenched at his sides, the faint chill of the house seeping into his bones. Paul was seated at the small kitchen table, his back hunched, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles were white. The light above them flickered faintly, casting shadows that seemed to grow longer and longer with every passing second. "It's not just food," Paul repeated, his voice low and steady now, but carrying a weight that made Casey's stomach turn. His eyes, sharp and unblinking, locked onto Casey's with an intensity that made him want to look away. But he didn't. He wouldn't. Casey shook his head, letting out a bitter laugh that felt more forced, even to his own ears. "You're insane. You realize that, right? You've got me living in a freezing, creaking house with what? Ghosts? Some kind of curse? What the hell are you even talking about?" Paul's expression didn't change. If anything, his features grew tighter, more strained, as if Casey's words physically hurt him. "It's not a curse," he said softly, the tremor in his voice almost imperceptible. "It's old. Older than this house. Older than you or me." Casey felt his frustration boiling over, anger mixing with unease in a way that made his chest tighten. "Old? What does that even mean, Paul? It's porridge. Butter and oats. I threw it away. Nothing happened." "Nothing happened?" Paul's voice rose, cutting through Casey's words like a blade. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the worn linoleum, and leaned across the table, his face inches from Casey. "Look around you. Look at yourself. You're pale, sick, falling apart. The house is shifting. It's waking up. And you think nothing's happened?" Casey stumbled back a step, startled by the intensity in Paul's voice. For a moment neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the creaks of the house settling or moving. Casey wasn't sure anymore. Why? Casey asked, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. Why does it matter so much to you? Why do you care what I do with some stupid bowl of oats? Paul sighed, the sound heavy with something that wasn't quite defeat, but close to it. He sat back down, his shoulders slumping, ran a hand through his hair. You don't get it, and you never will. You think this is about me? About what I believe? He shook his head. It's not. It's about respect. You don't have to understand it, but you sure as hell should have listened. Casey crossed his arms, his stubbornness flaring up again despite the faint tremor in his hands. Listened to what? You've never explained anything. You just put the porridge out and expect me to go along with it like it's normal. Paul's eyes flashed, and for the first time, Casey saw something raw in them. Fear, frustration, and something deeper. Something that felt like resignation. I didn't explain because I thought I wouldn't have to. Because some things don't need explaining. You don't disrespect it. You don't throw it away. You don't ask questions you don't want answered. Casey opened his mouth to argue, to say something, anything, but Paul cut him off with a sharp motion of his hand. You've already done it. You've already broken the one rule that matters. Now you deal with the consequences. Paul pushed past Casey without another word, his footsteps heavy and deliberate as he disappeared down the hallway. The air seemed to follow him, colder and heavier with each step, leaving Casey alone in the dim, flickering lights of the kitchen. He stood there for what felt like hours, the sound of his own breathing loud in his ears, his thoughts racing in circles. It's not just food, Paul's words echoed in his mind, sinking in deeper with each repetition. Casey couldn't shake the feeling that despite his anger, despite his disbelief, Paul wasn't lying. Something had shifted. Something had woken up, and it was waiting. Casey lay on his bed, drenched in sweat despite the freezing chill that gripped the house. His limbs felt like they were filled with lead, every movement slow and agonizing. His fever burned hot, a relentless fire that blurred the edges of reality. Shadows danced across the walls of his room, their movements unnatural and chaotic, like ink spreading through water. Every time he tried to focus on them, they shifted, eluding his gaze and slipping just beyond comprehension. The whispers were everywhere now, layered and overlapping, a dissonant chorus of voices that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Some were faint and indistinct, barely louder than a breath, while others were sharper, biting into his consciousness with words he couldn't understand. They were relentless, pressing into his mind, filling the room until the air itself felt thick and suffocating. Then he heard it, the sound of Paul's voice, low and urgent, coming from somewhere down the hall. Casey recognized his tone, that same pleading cadence he'd heard before, but it was different this time. Paul wasn't alone. Another voice joined his, guttural and inhuman, its rasping growl vibrating through the very bones of the house. It spoke in a language Casey didn't recognize, its words sharp and jagged, like the sound of breaking glass. Casey tried to call out, to demand answers, to beg Paul to stop. Anything, but his voice failed him. His throat was raw, his lungs too weak to push out more than a ragged gasp. Panic rose in his chest, heavy and suffocating. As the voices grew louder, their argument escalating into a horrifying crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. And then suddenly, silence. It was more jarring than the noise, the absence of sound so complete it felt deafening. Casey strained to hear anything. Footsteps, whispers, even the creak of the old wood. But the only sound was his own labored breathing. Just as he began to hope it was over, he heard it. The soft, deliberate clink of a bowl being set down just outside his door. His heart pounded, each beat a dull, aching thud against his ribs. Summoning every ounce of strength he had, Casey forced his head to turn toward the doorway. The effort left him dizzy, his vision swimming, but he saw it. A figure crouched low, just beyond the threshold, shrouded in shadow. Its body was wiry and unnatural, its limbs too long and bent at odd angles. Its face was obscured, hidden in the darkness, but its eyes burned, 2 points of fiery light flickering and shifting like embers, fixed on Casey with an intensity that froze the breath in his lungs. The longer he looked, the more his fevered mind insisted the eyes weren't just looking at him. They were inside him, peeling back the layers of his thoughts, his fears, his soul. Casey tried to move, to scream, to do anything, but his body betrayed him, locked in place by the fever and the crushing weight of the figure's gaze. It didn't move closer, didn't speak, but the air around it seemed to ripple, as if the very fabric of the room were bending to its presence. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Paul's words echoed. You don't have to believe it. Just don't disrespect it. Casey's eyes fluttered shut, his strength giving out as the fever pulled him into unconsciousness. The last thing he felt was the cold touch of something brushing against his hand. Light, fleeting, but undeniably real. Then, darkness. When Casey finally opened his eyes, the light filtering through the curtains felt strange, thin, and cold, like winter sunlight, even though he was certain it wasn't that time of year. His head pounded as his body ached, and his fever left a sticky sheen of sweat clinging to his skin. He tried to sit up, but his muscles refused, weak and trembling beneath the weight of exhaustion. The house was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that felt like it was waiting for something. Paul, the thought hit him suddenly, cutting through the fog in his mind. He needed to find Paul, to demand answers, to make sense of what had happened during the night. Summoning every ounce of strength he could muster, Casey swung his legs over the side of the bed and forced himself to stand. His vision blurred and swam, and the floor felt unsteady beneath him, as though the house itself were swaying. He gripped the edge of the dresser, steadying himself, before staggering toward the door. The hallway was colder than he expected, a sharp, biting chill that made the hairs on the back of his head stand on end. Paul's door was ajar, the faint scent of wood polish and old books wafting out. Casey hesitated for a moment, dread pooling in his stomach before pushing the door open fully. The room was empty, not just empty of Paul, but empty in a way that didn't make sense. The bed was neatly made, its covers smooth and untouched, the nightstand bare except for a single unlit candle. The shelves, once filled with books and trinkets, were vacant, a fine layer of dust outlining where objects had once been. Even Paul's slippers, which Casey had seen neatly placed by the bed the night before, were gone. It was as though Paul had vanished entirely, leaving no trace behind. "Paul," Casey croaked, his voice cracking in the stillness. There was no answer, only the faint creak of the house settling around him. He stumbled back into the hallway, his legs barely holding him up, and made his way toward the kitchen. The air grew heavier with each step, pressing down on him, thick and suffocating. When he reached the doorway, he froze. On the counter sat a fresh bowl of porridge. The butter, golden and glossy, melted slowly into the oats, sending up faint curls of steam. It looked exactly as it always had, warm, inviting, yet utterly wrong. Casey's stomach churned at the sight and his knees buckled, forcing him to grip the door frame to keep from collapsing. The bowl hadn't been there the night before. He was certain of it. Paul had taken the last one to his room, and now Paul was gone, but the bowl remained. Its presence was unnerving, as though it carried some lingering trace of Paul's absence, or worse, the thing he had been feeding. Casey's breath came in short, shallow gasps as the realization dawned on him, creeping over him like a shadow stretching across the floor. Whatever Paul had been protecting, whatever had been satisfied with his nightly offering, had turned its attention to him. He could feel it now, an unseen presence watching him from every corner of the house, from the twisting shadows on the walls and the faint hum of the air around him. He tried to look away from the bowl, but his gaze kept snapping back to it, drawn by an invisible pull. The butter swirled into the oats, forming shapes that seemed almost deliberate, almost alive. His skin prickled as the air around him grew colder, heavier, until it felt like it was pressing him into the ground. Whispers began again, faint and distant, growing louder with each passing moment. They were everywhere now, surrounding him, pressing into his skull, each word a blade slicing through his thoughts. His knees gave out and he sank to the floor, trembling as the realization solidified in his mind. Paul hadn't escaped. Paul had been allowed to leave. Casey wouldn't be so lucky. Casey remained crumpled on the cold kitchen floor, his breaths shallow and uneven. The whispers swirled around him, louder now, sharp and overlapping, as though the house itself was speaking, or whatever lived in the house. His eyes flicked back to the porridge, still steaming faintly on the counter, as if mocking him. The butter had melted completely, pulling around the edges, its golden surface shimmering in the dim light. He tried to crawl away, but his body felt sluggish, unresponsive, as if the air itself was pressing him down. The floor creaked under his weight, a groaning sound that seemed to echo unnaturally through the house. The shadows in the corners of the kitchen shifted and stretched, dark tendrils creeping toward him, pulling closer with every blink. "Paul," he asked, though he knew it was pointless. Paul was gone, taken, maybe spared. The thought sent a cold shiver through him. Whatever Paul had been feeding hadn't followed him. It had stayed behind, with Casey. He squeezed his eyes shut, desperate to block out the growing noise, the twisting shapes that seemed to crawl closer in his peripheral vision. But even with his eyes closed, he could feel it, the weight of something ancient and unrelenting pressing down on him, suffocating and cold. The whispers grew sharper, more insistent, forming fragments of words that scratched at his mind. too fast to comprehend, but filled with a sense of malice. Then came the laughter. It started low, almost imperceptible, but quickly grew louder, sharper, filling the room with a sound that made his skin crawl. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. It was too layered, too guttural, a rasping inhuman sound that reverberated through his chest like a physical blow. Casey's hand flew to his ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside him, clawing at the edges of his sanity. The shadows stopped moving. The air grew impossibly still, the oppressive cold replaced by a suffocating heat that made Casey gasp. Slowly, against his will, his eyes opened. The porridge was gone. The bowl sat empty, the butter streaked across its surface in jagged, chaotic lines. The sight sent a spike of fear through him, cold and unrelenting. He hadn't heard anyone move. He hadn't seen anything. But it was gone. Casey scrambled backward, his limbs weak and shaking, until his back hit the base of the cabinets. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so thick it pressed against his ears. He didn't want to look, didn't want to see, but something made him turn his head toward the doorway. It was there. The figure from the night before, its wiry, unnatural body crouched low, its burning eyes locked into him. This time there was no distance, no threshold keeping it at bay. It was in the room, its presence filling the space, suffocating and immense. Its limb twitched and shuddered, its movements jerky and wrong, as though it didn't quite understand how to move in a human world. Casey's breath hitched as the figure tilted its head, its eyes narrowing. A low, guttural growl echoed from deep within its chest, rattling through the air like thunder. Slowly it began to move toward him, each step deliberate and heavy, the sound of its footfalls echoing unnaturally.